Hi everybody. I'm Trish Kelly from the President's Group. So happy to be here with you today on the final day of Accessibility Week here in Canada. I wanted to start today by acknowledging that we, at least for myself, coming to you from the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations. Thank you to Jillian and to Catherine, who are helping improve our accessibility of this webinar today by providing ASL and closed captioning. I have a few things that I wanted to say about Accessibility Week. Today, as I mentioned, is Friday of this national initiative to raise awareness about accessibility in Canada. The President's Group is a leadership table for business owners of small businesses and CEOs of large companies who have made a commitment to employing people with disabilities. So this work means a lot to us, and I'm really glad that we could work with Small Business BC and the incredible team there to provide you with this whole week, as well as this really compelling webinar about how you too can be an inclusive employer. As I mentioned, the week finishes today, and we finished quite strong. We finished the week with an announcement from the that there will be another $15 million added to the opportunity fund, which helps businesses and employees become more accessible and gain access to the technology and employment. I'm hearing an echo on my stuff. And I'm sorry about that. Luckily, I'm pretty much done. I'm going to hand it over to the rest of our presenters. Yeah, I don't know if someone from Small Business has advice for that echo. Maybe I'll try. How about this? Can you still hear me? Yeah, okay, yes. So I've just I'm not doing the echo anymore for myself. So we have a really great agenda today for this 1 hour conversation. I'll give you just the beginnings of why accessibility and why an inclusion as an employer is important. And Jamie Millar-Dixon and Kristin Bauer are going to walk you through some amazing content that really covers the why, which is the business benefits, the what, which is what is an inclusive employer and how does it impact your brand as an employer and as a company in the community. And then also some of the how. So you'll get a bit of each of those, and they have such great content. I don't want to delay getting over to them. So we'll just move along now. Kristin Bauer and Jamie Millar-Dixon have been working in this space around inclusion for decades. They have so much knowledge that they share, and I'm so glad that we can connect their expertise to you as a small business audience. So I'll leave it there and say, take it away, Jamie and Kristin.
See the slide. You're muted, Kristin. Oh, I'm muted. Can you hear me now? Okay. Technical difficulties, right? In the new crazy world of Zoom and webinars. Yeah, so for some reason I can no longer see my slide deck, so I'm just going to go with my notes of what we're going to talk about today. Jamie and I, we're really excited to have this time together to share some things that we have always kind of known to be true through our experience, but even more so, we believe them to be true because we've spent quite a few months working with some really amazing employers in the downtown east side of Vancouver, but also some small business owners throughout Metro Vancouver as well, and that is the result. As a result, we have been able to put together an inclusive employment guidebook. And so some of the things that we're going to talk about today, and Jamie and I are going to trade back and forth, we're going to go through some of the key human resources concepts, how to think of recruitment in more inclusive ways. Traditionally, we've thought about recruitment in a pretty narrow definition, who's the best person, and we know that there are some things we can apply to make it more inclusive. We're going to talk about, what are those inclusive hiring practices and how they actually benefit your business. So they're good for people, but they're also really good for business. What are the recruitment strategies that you can adopt in order to access some untapped sources of really amazing talent? And then we're going to share some of the case stories. You can see many more case stories in the free resource, but we're going to go through some of the case studies of small businesses that are already practicing inclusive hiring. So as an employer, and if somebody could advance a slide for me because I don't have that up, that would be great. As an employer, you're very likely seeing that many of the things that we thought of as non-negotiables before COVID-19 are really now back on the table. So for employers, the idea that many jobs could be done remotely probably seemed impractical. And certainly I know that in the work that Jamie and I do, working with different clients and different employers, there was always a little bit of reticence around allowing employees to work remotely. But we're seeing through COVID-19 that actually it became an imperative, and so employers were able to make it happen. You're probably much more aware of what your employees need. So for example, who has caregiving responsibilities for children, for elder care? Who's having to juggle working from home and managing childcare responsibilities? Who has underlying health conditions? One of the things that I will mention as well is that the Angus Reid Institute did a study. They just released the results about 3 weeks ago. Typically, we've heard the statistic repeatedly: 1 in 5 Canadians will experience a mental health challenge at some point in their life. Angus Reid, through their study, were able to ascertain that now, as of right now, not in the future, 50% of Canadians are currently experiencing a mental health challenge as a result of what we've been going through with a global pandemic. And then when you add on top of that all of the things that we've been seeing in the news in the past week or so, include in regards to the death of George Floyd. So there's a lot going on. A lot around mental health, which is an invisible disability, and certainly some visible diverse abilities as well. And the good news is that open communication, transparency, encouraging your employees to talk about what those challenges might be, and encouraging them to bring their whole selves to work are really all practices of inclusive employers. So employers who weren't doing that before have kind of had to as a result of the shifting workplace landscape over the last few months. The other thing that you've probably noticed of late is that consumers are becoming much more interested in how their purchasing decisions can impact their community. So with the start of COVID, or as the global pandemic started to take hold and impact Canadian businesses, Canadians were becoming very aware of which were the organizations that were donating to different charities, first responders, who were pivoting in terms of the products that they were creating and distributing. A really great example is all of the breweries that we've seen from coast to coast that immediately started saying, hey, we've got alcohol, we've got bottles, we can make hand sanitizer. And a number of them were not only selling them, but donating them. And so that is a huge thing. The other thing that I will add, because I think that it's really, really relevant that we do talk about this, and I know Trish and Jamie and I were just talking about it before we got on the webinar, is acknowledging what is happening in terms of race issues. And so I think a really great example of an organization back in 2017 that took a stand for something that they believed in was Nike, and they signed Colin Kaepernick to a sponsorship deal. And that was a very controversial thing to do in 2017, but boy, fast forward 3 years and it's incredibly relevant. So, consumers are taking, they're watching what organizations are doing and how they're treating their employees. Absolutely. And I would also add that consumers are very concerned that it's not just about lip service. So don't talk about being inclusive unless you're actually being inclusive. So the action is the really important part to think about. And so with that, I'm going to pass this over to my partner, Jamie, and she'll start to get into some of the things that we learned within our research.
Inclusive employment, and we developed a business-to-business guide for employers on how to adapt each stage in the recruitment and retention process. This project was led by Mission Possible, a social enterprise on the downtown east side, and was funded through the Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Reduction. A little bit about the guide. A hard copy formal launch of the guide was produced. We were set to launch on March 11th. And on March 10th, we made the very difficult decision to postpone that formal launch. Unfortunately, we did. But the document is available online as a resource, and it's hosted currently on the President's Group site. We'll give you a link to that resource as well, so you can have that. And in addition, we'll be developing an e-learning series of modules over the next couple of months, funded through the project I lead, BC Partners in Workforce Innovation, BC WIN. And these e-learning modules will be offered on a complimentary basis to both BC WIN and President's Group employers, as well as the employers that Kristin works to support in this field as well. So if you're interested, feel free and reach out following. Yeah, so much of what we'll share with you is coming from the guide, but also coming from the years of experience that both Kristin and I have had in working with employers on their inclusive hiring initiatives. So what is inclusive employment? Well, it's really about having a workforce that reflects community, the communities that we live in, do business in. And in this case, we're talking specifically about people with disabilities, or those with diverse abilities, as I prefer to say, or others facing barriers to employment. And those barriers could be low literacy, cycles of poverty, lack of stable housing, lack of stable social connections, and so on. And what it really involves for us as employers and as organizations, it means looking at our traditional hiring practices to identify and remove barriers that we may not even be aware of, that unintentionally prevent people from being employed in our businesses. A little bit about the demographics here in Canada. So approximately, and as Kristin said, 1 in 5 Canadians with mental health will experience a mental health condition in their lifetime. Approximately 1 in 5 Canadians have some form of disability or barrier, whether visible or not. 6.2 million Canadians, roughly 75% of people acquire their disability as adults, which was something that surprised me when I first saw that stat. Canadian Mental Health Commission tells us that by the time Canadians reach 40 years of age, 1 in 2 will have had or have experienced a mental illness. That includes depression, anxiety, PTSD, and addiction. Roughly 10% of Canadians live in poverty, and the employment rate for people with disabilities is half of what it is for people without disabilities. So there is a largely untapped pool of people who are ready, willing, and able to work out there. Yeah. I'm managing 2 screens here, so pardon me as I go back and forth between them. So there's a lot of really clear data. The research is clear, hard to argue with. Hiring people with diverse abilities is actually good for business, and we'll share some of that information with you. Pre-COVID, we were facing fairly significant labor shortages in Canada. You probably experienced this as you were hiring before March of this year. We actually have no indication that these advantages will change post-COVID, and actually may become even more relevant than ever as consumers become more aware of their purchasing, and as our society comes out of this period more compassionate than ever, which I happen to believe we will. We still have an aging baby boomer population. We still have increased retirements, declining birth rates, although this year may actually be an exception, I'm not sure. Fairly steady job growth and fewer people to fill those opportunities. That's what we were experiencing just 3 months ago. 2018 report by the Business Development Bank of Canada concluded that those labor shortages were holding Canadian businesses back and were most serious in Atlantic Canada, British Columbia, and Ontario. And a recent study, Deloitte study of 750 hiring decision makers, 76% indicated that attracting candidates was their #1 challenge in their organization. Yet there's this whole pool of people who can work and want to contribute and are often overlooked. Recruitment practices, we look at this as our traditional employment practices. Those recruitment practices that we have in place in many of our organizations are typically aimed at screening candidates out. They once served a purpose when there was an abundance of candidates for every job, but in today's labor market, it's simply outdated. Some really great data on the President's Group website. If you haven't seen this yet, I encourage you to have a visit to the site. There's a lot of great resources there. Why is hiring people with disabilities good for business? Well, we were trending by 2029, BC employers will need to fill an estimated 861,000 job openings. And we have an opportunity to engage the over 614,000 working age British Columbians in those, to fill those job openings. And the data shows that as consumers, we prefer to see ourselves reflected and valued in the companies we do business with. And that may get even stronger as we move ahead. Being inclusive of people with, from different backgrounds with different skill sets and abilities actually increases an organization's financial success through an increased consumer base. And the research shows us that staff retention rate is higher, attendance is average or better. This is reports from employers. 90% said employment was equal to or better than coworkers without disabilities. Organizations that are diverse and inclusive are twice as likely to meet or exceed financial goals, 6 times more likely to be innovative. How important is that these days? And 6 times more likely to be able to effectively manage change. For your business, that gives you an expanded consumer reach, over $55 billion Canadian annually. That's the annual buying power of Canadians with a disability. And when you add family and friends into that and the stories that are told about how your business is valued, how you are valued by that business, that grows to over $366 billion Canadian annually. So a consumer advantage, a financial advantage, talent advantage, innovation advantage. The question really is, can your business afford not to be inclusive? When Kristin and I spoke with different leaders and organizations that were seen as being inclusive and supportive, we asked their leaders, what's motivating you to be inclusive? And there are many reasons why business leaders choose to provide an inclusive workplace. It's different for every company. But many will say they're driven to be inclusive because A, they clearly understand the business advantage, they get it, or they have personal experience, either themselves or a family member, a close friend with adversity or barriers to employment. They're motivated to make a positive difference to others. They take intentional steps to make sure that their workforce reflects the communities and customers that they do business in. Really interesting data for the Millennial Generation. They're a generation where inclusion is valued and expected. And for some, it's their mission, and they've established their business with inclusion in mind. We think of some of the social enterprises in particular. I love this quote from an employer we spoke with, and the employer quote is hiring managers who believe in the value of everyone in the workplace, it really pays off. When employees enjoy coming into work, there's such a real sense of purpose. They feel connected to each other and the community. They have increased self-esteem by contributing to something. And this holds true for all employees, not just people with barriers. So we are still operating in a time where we need talent on deck. We need all talent on deck. And we need to address those challenges and barriers that have typically excluded people from the workplace. Kristin's going to talk to us next about employer branding. So I'm just going to turn this back over to my colleague, Kristin.
Great, thanks, Jamie. And I'll ask you to keep moving the slides forward for me, please. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit now about external brand image and internal brand image. So how do you promote what that external brand is to drive recruitment and to tap into that really large talent pool that is largely untapped, and promoting the internal brand that really drives retention, engagement, and productivity. So let's talk a little bit about what are the 5 key elements of a really strong employer brand. So those would be culture, work environment, career opportunities, compensation, and benefits. So let's explore a little bit about what these are from an inclusion perspective, because I think that when you see those 5, and if you've worked in human resources or recruitment or any business, really, you get that those are really important elements. But what do they mean from an inclusion perspective? So really, when we start to explore a little bit around culture, a healthy workplace culture is really one that is built on trust, collaboration, responsibility, and support. And so it's about aligning your employer brand with the company's values, and it's made up of positive relationships between colleagues, managers, and leaders. So it's about relationship building, and how you build relationships is through trust and collaboration. And can you hear my dog barking in the background? I apologize for that. Just ignore him. So yes, to go back to workplace culture, caring, empathetic managers are really crucial. And I think probably 10 years ago, if we brought up the idea of empathy in the workplace, we might think, oh my gosh, there's no place for empathy in the workplace. It's about work. You come to work, you do your job, you go home. But the more that we learn about what inclusive leadership is, we know that empathy is actually a superpower. So I really can't underline that enough. Empathetic managers are absolutely crucial to inclusive workplaces. And through coaching and encouragement, you can set up your employees for success. So the second one here is work environment. Factors that really contribute to a positive work environment range really from understanding what your job responsibilities are to having a healthy work-life balance. And of course, I will mention that, these things also mean they have different definitions to different people, because we are all different, we're all unique. So work-life balance to me might mean something different to Jamie or to Trish. A sense of autonomy, personal achievement, respect, recognition. And I will say that all of these things, if you're ever curious about the national standard for psychological health and safety in the workplace, these are all psychosocial factors that have been identified as really crucial to creating a psychologically safe and healthy workplace. And really, you could use another word, which is inclusion. Career opportunities. So inclusive employers will focus on capacity building through training, coaching, and feedback. They provide flexible job opportunities, which goes to, It's about engaging people in a number of different ways to work. So traditionally, we used to think, you put a round peg in a round hole, and that person has to fit that work. Inclusive employers will also identify what somebody's capacity is, what they can do, as opposed to just focusing on what they can't do and making them fit into a box. Compensation and benefits, we know those things are important, but there is also another way of looking at them from an inclusive lens. So employee satisfaction with compensation and rewards, some considerations would be fairness and equity. Equity is an important concept. It doesn't necessarily always mean equality. Equity is a really important thing. Supportive employers also consider whether non-traditional compensation may be of value, including bonuses, meal plans, transit passes. I know that these are some things that employers are already doing, not all of them though. And so it's important to take a look at what might provide value to your employees overall, and to help really attract, a diverse talent pool. And then benefits could be, of course, certainly like the sort of the standard typical benefits such as healthcare, but other things such as personal days, wellness initiatives. There's a client of mine that I work with that have just said, you get X number of dollars per year. If buying a bike is your thing to be well, then here's your money to buy a bike. If taking that money to take a course, and maybe it's a guitar class, but that helps your mental health, that's what you use the money for. There was also a member of the steering committee, one of the inclusive employers from the downtown east side, who Jamie spoke with, and he spoke about the fact that they have, it's almost like a cabin I think it's on Vancouver Island, that they have in the past used that for employees as a benefit, something that some of their employees from the downtown east side have never even gotten out of the downtown east side. And so for them to be able to go and spend time in nature was a really wonderful benefit and opportunity for them. So there's opportunity to think outside of the box. Just because we've always offered standard benefits doesn't mean that those standard benefits meet everybody's needs or are even valued any longer. So there's opportunity absolutely right now to take another look at what we're offering in terms of our employee value proposition and our brand. So some of the tips that we have around how to strengthen your brand would be around championing, that was a tough one, championing inclusion. So that means that you're actually walking the walk on it. You're not just talking about it, but you're actually doing it. You're hiring people. You're focusing on abilities. So this is something that I mentioned a little bit earlier. You're focusing on what a person can do as opposed to what a person can't do. So when you are looking at adding somebody to your team, and I think a good recruiter will always do this, they'll talk with the person who's hiring and say, okay, tell me about your team makeup right now. Is everybody, if you're hiring accountants, are they all at a really senior level? And you could actually afford to bring in somebody who's perhaps a little bit more junior and train them up. It's really important to talk a little bit about what is the current composition of your workforce, where are your skills and abilities, and who can you bring in to complement those skills and abilities? And not just for now, but in the future. So what can somebody bring to your organization over the next few years? I think we've heard this a lot. Simon Sinek has said it before, hire for fit and train for skills. So there's opportunity to do that as well. Set and communicate inclusive hiring goals. I think this is really, really important. I'm working with a client right now around increasing representation of women in tech. And to really explain the why is so important because you don't want to fall into that pitfall really, which is, oh, we're just hiring to get that number up. We need to have X number of women, X number of people with diverse abilities. No, it shouldn't be that. It should be that you're doing it for all the right reasons, but you also need to communicate that. Set the goals. I think there is value in setting goals and working towards them, but the communication and the why is really crucial. Something that Jamie and I both really strongly believe in is partnering with community organizations for recruitment. When I was an in-house recruiter and an in-house diversity and inclusion manager, we worked very intentionally with some really wonderful organizations. Certainly BC Win. Sorry, Jamie, I'm going to put a plug in for you guys, but there's a lot of really great organizations out there. And if you build a relationship with them, not just when you immediately need somebody to hire like yesterday, but if you build a relationship with that partner and get to know them, they get to know you, you're going to have a higher quality of candidates. That supportive organization, that community organization with that expertise. And it could be in a number of different areas. It could be around people with diverse abilities. It could be Indigenous organizations. It could be new immigrants or refugees, people with mental health challenges and lived experience. There's a lot of really great organizations to partner with. So don't feel like you have to be the expert. There are a lot of great experts out there that can support you. And then I think is this the sixth point here is a really important one. We've been talking about it a lot over the last few years, and certainly more and more organizations are investing the time and the money in unconscious bias training. I do believe that it is a foundational element when you're having these diversity and inclusion conversations and you're working towards inclusion, because we all have bias. You know, as David Rock of the Neuro Leadership Institute in the US says, if you have a brain, you have bias. And so we need to recognize that bias in order to mitigate it. And so there's definitely some great work that can be done in that area that will really provide some lift within your organization. So you really want to shift, prepare for, create a culture of inclusion in your workplace, and that can include a number of different things that I've spoken about. It could be training, it could be having conversations. Even just starting conversations is an important piece. So when we talk now a little bit about more about inclusive employer branding, you can be really creative actually when it comes to designing your employment brand. Some quick tips that we've seen that have worked really effectively in the past for other employers, and certainly again I'll direct you back to the guidebook because there are some really great case studies in there. Highlight your employees. Put your employees on your website. Maybe there's a day in the life so that those potential new employees can see what it's like to actually work in your organization. You can have video testimonials. You can highlight employees with diverse abilities and just, in fact, diversity overall. I know for myself, and perhaps I am a little biased because I am a diversity and inclusion specialist, but whenever I work with a new client or if I'm curious about an organization, the first thing I do is I look on their website and I look to see who their senior leadership is. Is there diversity in their senior leadership? What does their careers page look like? Is it just a bunch of white people? So it's a really big opportunity on your careers page to showcase who you are, what you believe in, and what your people look like. And I mean that literally and figuratively. The other thing I would mention, and again, I've heard this from colleagues. I've experienced it myself when I worked in-house. But employee resource groups, so seeking feedback from an ERG, which is an employee resource group, is an amazing resource. Employee resource groups, if you don't have them in your organization, I would recommend that you consider starting them. They can be a wonderful tool, not only to give employees from a wide variety of backgrounds a voice in your organization, but they can also provide you really valuable, important feedback. So they can advise you on your employer brand and things that I spoke about earlier, like your compensation and benefits. Go to the experts. Ask your employees what's important to them and how they can help you to attract diverse candidates. An organization, a business that is seen as providing employees with a caring, respectful place to work is really highly valued in today's employment market. Absolutely. Jamie and I hear this constantly from our clients. We've certainly heard it from the steering committee members in the research that we did for the guidebook. And I think it's worth mentioning that we also did a number of focus groups with employees from those organizations. And they were all, everybody was singing from the same songbook. They were saying the same thing. This can really be leveraged to make it easier and more cost effective for you to hire and retain from a much wider talent pool. The next slide is an example of an inclusion tip that we've included, no pun intended, within the guidebook. There are a number of tips that really stood out from the steering committee members. And this is one that I love, and I think it's fair to say it's one of Jamie's and my favorite tips. And that is really about asking the experts. So what this tip says is, the best way to ensure that your employee value proposition hits the mark with inclusion is to ask the experts, your employees. Ask what they like most about working with your company, if they view the business to be supportive, and what you could do to provide a more inclusive environment. Include all staff in these conversations. You can do this through team meetings, an informal online survey, one-on-one meetings, focus groups, or through an employee engagement or inclusion survey. You can also reach out to a community partner for ideas and support. I'll share just a really quick example of an organization that a few years ago decided that they were going to hire somebody with some significant diverse abilities, some significant barriers to mobility. And they had the right intention. They got a number of people sitting at the table to ensure that the hiring and onboarding would be successful. And guess who was the one person that was not literally at the table? It was the person that they were hiring. And unfortunately, the person ended up leaving because they hadn't been engaged in a conversation. And so it's so important, just always go back, just ask the expert. If it's somebody who's been experiencing barriers and a challenge for most of their life, I'll tell you, they've got a lot of life experience that they can share. So I'm going to pass this back now to Jamie, and she's going to take you through
Kristin, on employer branding. Thank you for that. So I'm going to cover off different stages in the recruitment process, the hiring practice, various ways to make sure or adapt your hiring practices so that you make sure inclusion is included in that process. And before looking at specific practices, we're going to start with barriers to employment. Barriers can be personal barriers experienced by the individual or barriers that are present in the workplace. Combined with unconscious bias towards people who face multiple barriers, this can keep an individual in a constant cycle of unemployment, underemployment, and poverty. So some of the typical barriers to employment are attitudes towards people who are different. Some HR policies and practices, whether intentional or not, can be a barrier. Rigid hiring processes traditionally aimed at screening people out. If an individual has a learning disability, poor self-esteem, a mental illness, lack of readiness, or lives in poverty, that can be a fairly significant barrier to employment. And then, of course, unconscious bias and stereotypes. And Kristin touched on that a little earlier as well. Rethinking work. So we have an opportunity, especially now, to rethink how work is performed in our organizations. Not all jobs need to be full-time. Not every job seeker wants or needs to work full-time. And I think especially through this period of being redeployed from home and working from home, it's going to provide us with some interesting opportunities going forward. When you're rethinking work, being flexible is key. And it can be a real win for both the organization and the individual. You can rethink how jobs are structured and delivered and performed. Your business may even have temporary needs or one-off needs that, for for someone to do certain tasks, either once a week, once a month, a casual basis, part-time, as well as full-time. We'll talk a little bit about that as well as we move forward. We do have inclusion tips sort of scattered throughout different phases of the hiring process, and this is one that we heard from an employer. Flexibility is key. So with new distancing guidelines comes more spacious workplaces, in some settings at least, which could result in the workspace being more conducive for somebody who uses a wheelchair for mobility, for example. But if you're a more supportive employee, you will gain access to a wider talent pool. Are you open to being flexible and working from home options as a result of the COVID-19 experience? What alternative work arrangements are now more possible than they were before? It's certainly accelerated working from home. Things to do when you're looking at your website and careers page is start by making sure that the website is accessible, that your application process, is your application process creating an unintended barrier? Some of the things to include on your website and careers page: your mission and vision and values, any employment recognition awards that you've received either as a small business, a medium business, or a large business. What makes you stand out as an employer of choice, as an inclusive employer of choice? You should include how to apply to positions, including accessible options for someone who can't navigate an online process, for example. You should highlight the recruitment and selection process and any supports that are available for people with diverse abilities if required. And then who to contact if that person requires support with the process to apply to work with your company. If you're not sure if your website or your careers page on your website is accessible, ask a diverse group of people to test drive it for you. Be sure to include people who have blind or have a visual impairment, people with autism or diverse cognitive abilities, or people who live with a mental illness. It will give you a fairly wide advisory group on how accessible your careers page really is. Job postings. Consider whether you're posting where you're posting opportunities and where you might draw the best candidate pool. Some things to think about: do you invite applicants from diverse backgrounds and abilities to apply? Do you have a statement that encourages people who from diverse backgrounds to apply with your company? Partner in local job fairs and hiring events hosted by community partners. I know there are lots of organizations, especially here in the Lower Mainland, that provide job fairs, and they're free of charge to participate most times. People with disabilities actually use LinkedIn and Indeed as part of their job search too. And if you have a need for sort of one-off casual labor, there are groups like Ember's Staffing Solutions, for example, in downtown Eastside who can help with that. Some of the social enterprises as well. You could be creating some meaningful employment for the people in your community by expanding how you source candidates. Language. Another key thing before posting your job is to review the language in your job description for anything that's not inclusive. You can ask for somebody else's feedback on that. They might even help you identify some unconscious bias that's in there, again, whether you realize it or not. Do you really need to have that level of qualifications, skills, and previous experience that you've always asked for? Or if things changed since the last time you posted or hired for that job, have a look at your job descriptions and look at what you can reasonably adjust to be more inclusive and encourage applicants from a larger talent pool to apply with your business. Some of the things you can do to be deliberate and intentional with your recruitment. First of all, taking an intentional, active outreach to recruit diverse talent. Look at developing candidate pipelines. Work with some of the service organizations in the Lower Mainland. I think we've got two really great organizations that I could see earlier registered on this webinar. Open Door Group works with a lot of the Vancouver catchments, and WCG Services works with employers in the Burnaby catchment, reach out to those organizations and see what they can do to help you develop a candidate pool, provide training, help you support job seekers. Again, a lot of it's free to you as an employer. And then hire from a trained candidate pool, so you can develop training to prepare people for opportunities in your organizations, and then hire from that candidate pool when people have finished their training. Adapt your interviews and assessment tools. Behavior-based interviews, for example, can be really tricky, and we'll talk about that next. Invite people on site for exclusive hiring events in your organization on a specific day. Disclosure is a big one, but have some open dialogue on expectations with a focus on abilities in relation to the opportunity. Asking what adjustments would bring out the best in each candidate will help benefit every candidate. Working with a job coach, if that person requires a job coach, that will help bring out their best in the interview and will help set that employment relationship up for success. You can use work experience, job shadowing, internships, practicums, all a way to build a candidate pool for your organization. And again, another little shameless plug for BC Win. We're happy to help. When you're considering your applications, I guess, is there a way, are you open to prioritizing job seekers with diverse abilities? That's one way to sort of, I've heard this referred to as stack the deck. If you're intentional about your efforts to be inclusive, you may want to intentionally screen in applicants who identify as having a disability, right? This is a chance to easily increase the diversity within your selection process and provide an opportunity for people who are traditionally underrepresented. Again, if they don't have the skills or the person is not a good match, they can then be screened out. Right? Disclosure. May not know if the candidate identifies as having a disability or is from a different group unless you encourage and provide opportunities for disclosure. While you can't ask the person if they have a disability, you can ask them to let you know if they require any accommodations or ask what adjustments, if any, would be required for that candidate to do their best work. Right? Examples would be a stand-up desk if the person has back pain, or a quiet workspace to enable concentration, checklists for people who have diverse cognitive abilities, or earlier or later start times to accommodate any regular medical appointments. But these opportunities can come up at any stage, really, either the referring partner organization, at hiring events, in the application process, all of those areas, anytime in the employment relationship, disclosure can occur. Also consider different types of interviews, right? We know about telephone interviews. We're doing a lot more virtual interviews, at least our team has been lately, in-person interviews. But one area you might not be as familiar with is a working interview or work trial. And we'll talk about that in a couple minutes. A tip for you in terms of adjusting your interviews could be holding the interview in a quiet space if the person gets overwhelmed by noise, or a wheelchair accessible location if the applicant uses a wheelchair for mobility. Understanding those communication options for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. Shifting to non-behavior based questions for people with autism, or having a job coach present to support candidates with diverse cognitive abilities. Right. The reason why we're suggesting, I don't know how many organizations are currently using, within small business, are currently using behavior-based questions. Chances are you are. Certainly medium and larger employers have long used behavior-based questions. The reason why these are so tricky for people with diverse cognitive abilities is there's just so many options in the range in the way that those questions are asked, and people can get lost in all of that verbiage and in the way that the questions are asked. I spoke to you about working trials and working interviews. A really great approach, very effective at determining whether a candidate can do or learn task-oriented jobs, especially useful for people with diverse cognitive abilities, people who are nonverbal, for example, or people whose anxiety gets in the way of communicating well in a structured interview, is show, do, review. So the candidate is shown how to do a task, for example, data entry or filing or recycling. has an opportunity to do the task after being shown how to do it, and then strengths are reviewed on how well the candidate performed. It's a very effective interview style, and if you've not used it before, I encourage you to work with some of the local service organizations to help facilitate that in your company. Yeah, personality assessments also. Some organizations use psychometric testing. Those tests can be very tricky for people, again, with diverse cognitive abilities, especially some of folks with autism. Very detail-oriented, can get stuck in the question of, do I strongly agree? Do I agree? Do I somewhat agree? Like really that whole process of asking those types of questions, the person just does not do well. It's not a reflection of their personality. I would rely more on an interview to assess that. And then finally, just a couple final points here. In your job offers, so offers of employment, if an accommodation or workplace adjustment's been identified during the interview process, you can include this in the letter of offer. So for example, our company is committed to accommodating the needs of employees with diverse abilities. To ensure that these are in place before you begin work, here's what we have put in place, and then actively offer if there's anything else that you need as you start the job, let us know. Then that way you're putting that active offer out there. And finally, broadening references. This is especially important for people who've not been in the workforce recently or at all. Is considering to broaden those references. Typically we look for previous employment references, but they just might not be there. It could be a supervisor from a volunteer job, an employment program manager, a job coach, an instructor, somebody who's able to provide some relevant and valuable information on the person's strengths and ability to do that job. So Kristin mentioned earlier that we had a chance to speak with a number of people who benefited from inclusive hiring, supportive hiring initiatives as part of the development of the business-to-business guide. So we asked a number of people who face barriers to employment, what does work, having a job, what does that mean to you? I just wanted to share some of that with you. Really to remind us to never underestimate the power of having a job, that sense of purpose and worth, aside from the financial benefits, that having a job provides purpose and meaning and connection to others. And these are just some of the words that people shared with us, and we wanted to share that with you. So at this stage, I'm going to turn this back over to my colleague, Kristin. And we're happy to take your questions.
Great, thanks, Jamie. Yeah, I just wanted to really underline what you just said, that employment is much more than having a job. Something that I have said frequently, and I believe this to be true, is that employment is social and financial inclusion. People don't just work to earn a paycheck. They work because of social networks. They work to have a sense of connection and belonging, and that they're contributing to something. So really employing people from diverse areas and levels of ability helps us to build stronger communities. And I think that's a really important thing for us to all work towards. Now, I do want to acknowledge it's 11:31. I know we did start a few minutes later than the original start date. So certainly Jamie and Trish and I are available to stay on and answer any questions that you may want to pose for the next few minutes. And certainly we're available offline as well. And I know that Trish has been posting things in the chat box as well around resources. So if there's any questions, we would love to hear them and answer them for you.
Might I suggest that we say a quick goodbye and thank you to those that may need to be moving on to the next part of their agenda, and then we'll stick around to answer any questions that haven't been in the chat box yet. But wanted to say thank you so much, Jamie and Kristin, for sharing your knowledge and for allowing the President's Group to host the Untapped Talent Guidebook on our website. You will be able to download a copy of the slides from today, but you also have access to that very comprehensive guide that much of this content was drawn from. And I want to say thank you to everyone that did make it to this call today. I know that this has been an incredibly difficult week for many people in your organizations and many of you as business owners. And on top of the pandemic, which was part of the reason that we brought this webinar together, there has been even more that has come up that is competing for your attention. And I really want to say thank you for your demonstration of your inclusion by being here with us today. And if you want more support in terms of doing this work, we've shared the President's Group website, accessibleemployers.ca. There is a lot of information, an entire resource hub there. You can join our community of accessible employers and become part of a community of others that are taking this work on as well. So thank you so much to everyone. If there was one question that came up in the chat, which I know that Michaela from the President's Group did put one answer together, but I wonder if maybe Kristin or Jamie, you might want to tackle it as well from your very tenured perspectives. And I don't know that I can see it right now on my screen, but it was a question around, given what's been going on with the amount of anti-Black racism in the States and how that's impacting our media consumption in our workplaces. Do you have any commentary around the intersection of how we deal with inclusion, accessibility, and racism in the workplace? Is that something that you would be able to give any commentary on when you're thinking about recruiting, especially? I think the question was around getting started as with your hiring practices and from that lens.
I think there's a lot to unpack there, and so maybe I'll start first, and then Jamie, I'll pass it over to you. I do think that it's really important that we, what you just mentioned there, Trish, about social media, and somebody who posed a question around that. There was a study that was done after the Boston Marathon bombings, and I actually posted this on LinkedIn, so if you follow me, it's in my feed. I put a link to the actual research, but it showed that those who were exposed to media reports of the bombing through both traditional and non-traditional media, so social media or watching the evening news, had a higher level of a negative psychological impact on them than it was on the people who actually experienced the bombing itself, which I think is a frightening thing to learn. It just shows how, the media and the stories that we consume have an impact on our on our mental health in a negative way. And so that relates back to what I was saying earlier as well about, everything that we've been watching over the past few months around a global pandemic. So there's a lot of things going on there. I was also speaking with a colleague earlier this week who works for a financial institution back east. And they were saying that they just created opportunities for their employees, their racialized people, but specifically the Black employees, to come together and just to talk about some of the things that are going on in the world. And I think it's really important that employers recognize that what's happening in the world is impacting their employees, and then that impacts the workplace. So we can't just draw that solid line of what happens outside of work happens outside of work anymore. It's that concept of bringing your whole self to work. And if you care deeply about what's going on in the world, that's going to have an impact on you. And so what I think how that translates to recruitment is that candidates are also watching employers and organizations to see how they're responding, and if they're just going to post on social media or if they're actually creating change to create a better world, to really to foster inclusion for everybody, they're going to be more drawn to those organizations. Jamie, I don't know if there's anything you want to add. So I'm sure there's a million things you could add from the recruitment perspective on that.
Yeah, I would echo what you're saying, Kristin. I think what we have right now in our organizations, like the worst has happened. So now it's a matter of what do we do about that? And we have a perfect opportunity to demonstrate leadership in our organizations by having some difficult conversations. So, a question to ask your teams is, how is racial discrimination having an impact on our teams? And if so, how? And how is that surfacing in our organization? Don't be afraid of having those tough conversations. The other thing I would suggest, if you haven't done any of this yet, is explore unconscious bias. You can, LinkedIn Learning has some really great online learning opportunities. Kristin specializes in that area as well. It doesn't have to cost your organization a small fortune to do that, but begin to explore how unconscious bias is having an impact on our hiring decisions. And that will be, as you begin to peel back the layers of unconscious bias, that will apply to
Jamie,
just fill in the blank.
Jillian,
right?
Who's been kindly interpreting for us, has to go. So we probably should wrap up now. We have a few questions that were still on the screen, but I'm sure that we'd be happy to have anyone reach out to us with specific questions, either through the President's Group website or our own website.
Yes.
Thank you to everyone for joining us today.
Thank you, Jillian.
Great. Thank you, Jillian. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you.
I think,
for now.
Is
that us now, Trish?
Now. Thanks, everybody.
We signing.
Although I can't see the little screen anymore that shows
Thank
who's
you.
still on the call. So I'm going to assume that we can all just sign off now. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend.